Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives. Our guest today is Dr. Najmaldin Karim, who is a practicing neurosurgeon in the Washington, D.C. area and also the President of the Washington Kurdish office. Welcome, Dr. Karim.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
I think I should start by talking about the fact that you are also the benefactor behind the new endowed chair in Kurdish political studies at the University of Central Florida. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how that came to be and what you think might develop from this chair?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. But this started about 2 years ago, I think. You were a central part of it. It started, of course, when Jay Gardner came and said, you know, we have a great university down in Orlando. It's called Central Florida University. It's, at that time, I think he said it was 7th or 8th largest university in the country. There are a lot of people in that area who are interested in politics. And he knew that I always wanted to, you know, advance and get somewhere to find some political science studies chair to deal with Kurdish studies and all that. So I believe that you have, you and him have talked, and then of course we met, all three of us, and you know the rest. I think it's a great opportunity.
Great opportunity, and now we're 6th largest university in the country.
Now you are 6th largest.
More students than ever.
Yeah, and it's exciting. I'm excited about it, and I can already see the interest in this. I have been, once you announced it actually in your journal here, and also on the internet, on your website, I got a lot of calls from people asking about it. And actually some wanting to come and apply for the position of professorship.
Right, and now we have a whole series of activities related to the Kurdish political studies theme.
Yes.
So everyone in our audience today will be hearing more about this in the weeks and months ahead.
And it's a great thing for us because, as you know, not too many people know about the Kurds, although since 2003, I think there is a little bit more than before, but generally people are not aware of the Kurdish issue, where they are, what they have been through. They don't, a lot of people don't believe that there are 40 million Kurds in the world, and yet they don't have a recognized independent state.
Why don't you tell us, for the benefit of the audience, a little bit about the Kurds? What do you think might be 2 or 3, in addition to the population figure you just mentioned, 2 or 3 fun facts about Kurds and Kurdish culture that would be of interest to our audience?
Well, if you, Kurdistan region is an area that encompasses southeastern Turkey, northwest Iran, north part of Iraq, and northeast part of Syria. These areas used to be called Mosul Wilayat. Wilayat meant like a province or a state. And it was part of the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, Ottoman Empire disintegrated, of course, and modern Iraq was found. And modern Iraq was found by carving part of Kurdistan and adding it to what is Iraq today. The reason they did that, first, they thought that there will be some oil, some wealth there, the British at the time, but also really when they established the new state of Iraq, by bringing the Kurds, they thought that they will have enough Sunnis to counterbalance the number of the Shias, because most of Iraq would have been Shia, because the other 2 wilayats or provinces were Baghdad and Basra. And the majority of people in those places were Shia, so they wanted to counterbalance it. And then they imported a king from what is today Saudi Arabia, from Hijaz. They imported him, King Faisal. He was not an Iraqi or born in even today's Iraq. And so that's how Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, became part of Iraq and Kurdistan of Turkey. So Kurdistan was carved, in a sense, between these states, and that has led to problems since then. In Turkey, the Kurds were basically denied everything. Everybody had to call themselves a Turk, and actually they have a slogan. They say, I'm paraphrasing, but only Turks are happy. If you're Turk, you're happy, and there is no one else other than Turks in Turkey, when 20% of the population are Kurds, actually. And then, of course, that led to the fact that Iraq really never functioned as a state. So eventually, one coup d'etat after coup d'etat led to emergence of the worst dictatorship probably in the history of Middle East, when Saddam Hussein seized power. And they committed atrocities and genocide against the Kurds, used chemical weapons, deported hundreds of thousands of people, evacuated and destroyed every village in Kurdistan, ethnic cleansing in many areas of Kurdistan. And then, of course, this was not enough for him. He also invaded Kuwait. He invaded Iran. And all of this, when we were actually, you know, the governments throughout the world and the United Nations were supportive of his regime. And finally, when it got to the point that they could no longer tolerate him, after he invaded Kuwait, that's when his downfall started and eventually led to the removal from power in 2003. And since then, of course, the Kurdish situation has improved. Actually, it started in 1991 after Saddam invaded Kuwait.
Let's talk about both pieces, maybe starting with 1991, after the first Gulf War. What was the Kurdish reaction after there was this Allied intervention that drove Iraqi forces out of Kuwait? What were they thinking was likely to happen?
Well, you know, that was something that everybody thinks God must have loved the Kurds, because the situation was so bad. Saddam suddenly decided to invade Kuwait. I mean, killing Kurds, evacuating Kurdistan, everything was not important because nobody knew who the Kurds were and they were in the mountains. But Kuwait was a different story. Kuwait was an independent state with a lot of money, and then there was threat to Saudi Arabia, so that's when the international community, under the leadership of the US, decided to respond. The Kurds were very happy with that. But even then, Kurds, when they rose up to overthrow the regime with the Shias in the south, the Western powers, and particularly the United States, did not back them up. Even though President Bush says we will let the Iraqi people rise up and get rid of this dictator, when they did, unfortunately, they were left alone. Saddam was allowed to fly his helicopters, his planes, and crush the uprising. And that led to about 2 million people from Kurdistan leaving everything, and they went to the mountains. You probably saw that in '91 on television screens. And I think that exodus of people with children dying and showing, and I have to commend the media, because if it was not for the media showing what was going on, I think this thing would have gone again unnoticed. And I think that led to the fact that you know, President Bush finally decided to act. President Mitterrand, Prime Minister Major, and actually President of Turkey, Turgut Özal, was also instrumental in that. They passed the resolution 688. They established the safe haven, and that was really the beginning of good things happening in Kurdistan.
Yeah, so you're basically telling a story that even to this day, very few people relatively know about, especially here in the United States. They did see those images of people fleeing in the early 90s, but then attention was distracted by other things. But there was another story that went on after those safe areas were established, which was the beginning of basically a renaissance among the Kurds in terms of the economy, in terms of the political system. Tell us a little bit about that largely unseen story. That
well,
developed.
after Saddam, of course, was back in power, but that area of Kurdistan was called no-fly zone, so he couldn't fly his planes, and he couldn't really. And President Bush at that time, arbitrarily demarcated it by parallel 36. We wished it was 32 because that would have included other important areas of Kurdistan. But nonetheless, that led to the fact that people started coming back to their homes. Once they started coming back to their homes, which was completely destroyed with nothing left, they started rebuilding. And in 1992, in May of 1992, for the first time in history of Iraq, there was a free election. Everybody voted. Everybody who could vote voted. I don't think you have that percentage of people voting in any other place. And that led to the formation of the first parliament in Kurdistan, and a government was formed. And people gradually started rebuilding their lives and all that. And
so within the borders of a dictatorial system,
yes,
you have an emergent democratic process.
Exactly. We did have that, but we still had a lot of problems because as soon as that happened, Saddam Hussein imposed embargo on the Kurdistan region, which means no money, no fuel, no electricity was allowed in that area. To say, okay, to show the Kurds particularly, but also the others, that, okay, I'll let you govern yourself and all that, and you can't do it. It's because he put embargo. But on top of that, there was embargo on Iraq. And embargo on Iraq technically was on Kurdistan as well. So our people really suffered during that time because they had double embargo on them. And we will get trickle things, smugglers bring things across the border, Turkish tankers coming, buying oil and smuggling it, and we will get money from the border crossing and all that. That's how really the economy started to come back, but it was the resiliency of the Kurdish people. And of course, what that led to is, after that, President Bush became the most popular. This is Bush, the father, became the most popular person. So when newborns were actually named after him, Haji Bush, they called him. They called him Bush. There are kids now, 16, 17, 18 years old, they're called Bush, after the Bush, the first President Bush. And then, this situation continued, and gradually relationships started with the United States when U.S. officials would come to Kurdistan, and the Iraqi opposition groups started to base themselves in Kurdistan to be active against Saddam Hussein's regime. And then, of course, President Bush was elected. The Bush administration came in 2000. And then after 9/11, of course, with terrorism and everything, U.S. felt that Iraq was a threat to the region, to the international peace and stability. And eventually, we had Saddam overthrown in 2003.
So this is all, I think, a very interesting story, and probably parts of this are being heard by our audience for the first time. You had, as you said, an emergent democratic process and a free market economy that were developing in Kurdistan during this dozen-year period before the 2003 intervention.
Right.
And that's an amazing story. And then after the intervention, after Saddam Hussein was overthrown, once again, another renaissance of a sort took place, because now all of the restraints were removed, or many of the restraints. And Kurdistan has progressed in some amazing ways in the past 5 years.
Yes, it has. You're correct. And actually, what happened after 2003, the Kurds, for the first time, the Kurds started to be part of Iraqi government, as opposed to being dumped on and hid by Iraqi central government.
Could you mention, just so that, again, for our audience's benefit, they'll understand just how prominent a role the Kurds play in Iraqi politics, starting with the presidency?
Well, as soon as Saddam was overthrown, General J. Gardner, who is from Orlando, was administrator of Iraq for a short period of time. He convened a meeting in Baghdad. And as soon as he went into Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein, he went to Kurdistan and he invited both Kurdish leaders, Jalal Talabani and Masoud Barzani, and both of these gentlemen later became president of Iraq and president of Kurdistan respectively. He invited them, and then the process started. Jerry Bremer came, and then the constitution, the process for drafting the constitution. Before that, it was an interim constitution, and then the permanent constitution was voted on in 2005. That led to election of a sovereign Iraqi government after that. And in that government, the president is Kurdish, the foreign minister is Kurdish, the chief of the staff in the army is Kurdish, and deputy prime minister, and then we have several ministers who are Kurds also. I mentioned that doesn't mean we don't have issues and challenges with the government, but you could see the difference. I mean, these people, when I talk about the president of Kurdistan, president of Iraq, these people were in the mountains fighting Saddam Hussein since the 1960s. And they were considered rebels, traitors, everything. And actually, Saddam Hussein at one time issued amnesty for everybody, but excluded Jalal Talabani. He was the only one that was excluded from the amnesty.
So rebels one day and then
well,
part of the government the next.
And then when Talabani became president, Saddam, before he was executed, he sent a letter to Talabani, asking him to do certain things.
Interesting
Yes.
story. And so now, to go back to your original point about how the Kurds do not have their own state, and they've been on the margins of politics and other aspects of the countries in which they're located, suddenly you have a Kurd who is president of Iraq. What has this done for Kurds in the region and worldwide in terms of raising the profile of Kurdish issues?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, the Kurds are in Iran, in Turkey, and Syria. So the Kurds in these places, when they see the situation in Iraqi Kurdistan is progressing, and Iraqi Kurdistan is becoming more prosperous, and they have more say in what Iraq does as a country. I mean, before Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran will get together and gang up how to attack and destroy the Kurds. Well, now this cannot happen. So, and the Kurds see that. The Kurds see that, for example, President Talabani can be a factor in bringing Turkey and the Kurdistan regional government closer to each other. He goes to Iran, and they know he's not just president of Iraq, but he's also a Kurdish leader. So that helps with establishing relationship between these countries, but also for the Kurds themselves. When President Talabani talks about Kurdish issue in Turkey, and he talks about this issue cannot be solved militarily, it has to be solved through dialogue, that's very important because it's coming from President of Iraq, which is something new for all the Kurds, and it gives them hope and encouragement that their condition will improve, and it gives them sense of pride as well.
How do the Kurds generally view the situation in Iraq today? There are so many things that have yet to be decided. There's still conflict in some parts of the country. The political system hasn't found its ideal path. There are disputes over access to resources. It's a long list of problems and challenges, but are they generally optimistic that we'll be able to work through this period, or are they concerned that there are large problems looming on the horizon that could undermine this experiment with a democratic Iraq with a free market?
Well, actually there are significant worries. There are a lot of challenges. I mean, we have accomplished a great deal of things in the Constitution. But unfortunately, Constitution is as good as what you do with it. The successive Iraqi government since 2004, when it was first formed, really have not been genuinely working and trying to implement the Constitution. The most important part of the Constitution, that if it does not get resolved, could actually lead to conflict again between the Kurds and the Iraqi government, and that is Article 140. Article 140 deals with territories that are part of Kurdistan, but through process of ethnic cleansing and Arabization, which means bringing Arabs and expelling Kurds in the region, the government has destroyed to an extent that changed their demographics. And Article 140 deals with that issue in Kirkuk and also other territories. And basically what it entails, we were supposed to have had an election by December of 2000, a census by 2007 in December, and have a referendum for the people to decide for these regions to join Kurdistan Regional Government, which is part of Iraq anyway. But we feel like these are the people who have been subjected to all kind of atrocities and genocide and ethnic cleansing, and it's time for these injustices to be reversed. And Saddam Hussein should not be rewarded by keeping his legacy of having Arabized these areas and performed ethnic cleansing. And to reassure the others, particularly people in this country, Kirkuk is very rich in oil, but in the Constitution, it clearly says that all revenues from natural resources, which includes oil, gas, water, everything, it's shared by the population. All the revenues is shared and distributed to every region, every province, according to the percentage of the population.
Tell us about the current status of the conflict in Iraq. From the beginning, there's been a debate in U.S. society about how long U.S. troops should stay, and from quite early on there was attention focused by some on bringing them home as quickly as possible, and now that debate has intensified. At what point, realistically, do you think the United States will be able to bring back not just the combat troops, but the forces that it has in the region, in addition to those which some think may need to stay in place for quite a few years?
I believe that the United States cannot withdraw completely from Iraq in the foreseeable future. And what I mean by foreseeable future, probably the next 10 years. But the United States also does not need to keep 150,000 or even 100,000 troops. They can significantly reduce the number, but that has to be done gradually. It has to be done in steps, in a thoughtful way. You have to train the Iraqi security forces. And I'm not talking about army. Iraq does not need an army, because Iraq has used its army to attack its own people and attack other countries. But security forces, police, border guards, and these, to teach them how to work, how to respect human rights, how to act like within a civil society where there is respect of law. I think this needs to be done. You also have to, obviously, having the biggest embassy in the world in Baghdad, you need some forces to protect that. And then there is always danger of re-emergence of Al-Qaeda and terrorist remnants of the Ba'ath and Saddam's regime, that they could come back if they see the opportunity and disturb the situation. Also, we have to remember there are elements within the Shia community who are also extremists and then have been engaged in sectarian violence and sectarian cleansing of their own. And these people are also laying low, and they could emerge at any time. That's why the presence of U.S. troops there is still very, very critical. Yes, probably, I'm not a military person, but I'm sure it can be reduced. But as far as complete withdrawal and fast withdrawal, I think that's unrealistic. And I think from my discussions with people who work with both campaigns, I think that's how they see it as well.
What do you think are the most significant short-term challenges? And I would date that from the time the next U.S. president takes office. What must he do? What kinds of things will he deal with during the first 100 days in Iraq specifically?
In Iraq specifically, I think one thing is very important: don't take your friends for granted. Throughout the past few years, there has been a lot of pressure on the Kurds to make concessions on a lot of important things to them. I think the Kurdish leadership is getting to the point that they can no longer afford to do that, otherwise they will lose support of their people. I think the US government should be very serious and clear about following the Iraqi constitution. What I mean by that is Article 140, the oil law, these are things that have to be implemented the way the constitution says. If the Kirkuk issue is not resolved, it can lead to breakup of Iraq completely, because there will be such a violence that no one can control. I think Fallujah and Ramadi and Anbar will pale comparing it to that, if that was to happen. I think it's very important that for the United States to make sure that we will not have dictatorship of majority in Iraq, because that's a clear danger now, and that is danger not only to the Kurds but also to the Sunni Arabs. And I think one last thing that's very important is whether we have Obama or McCain, I think federalism is a critical step towards solving Iraqi problem. And I think what Biden has recommended is probably very, very useful to follow. It was mistakenly, or people who didn't like it, they called it partition. This is not partition. And actually, I think that's the only way you can bring Iraq together and all the communities to govern themselves through decentralization. They have their own security forces. They have their own free market economy. But we will have common currency, common foreign policy, and protection of our borders. The rest of it should be local.
Good. Well, thank you, Dr. Karim, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you for the Global Perspectives Office. I'm John Bersia, and we'll see you next time.